All right, so yeah, I actually don't know what you guys know about this, but I wrote a book about an owl. But really, before I get into the owl and really the story of the book, I do want to give a little more about, like I told you, kind of how I became a scientist, but I want to talk a little bit more about what it is exactly that I do. So I'm a wildlife biologist. And so essentially what that means, I'm working with wildlife, wild animals in order to kind of make the world a better place for them. And I've done all kinds of stuff. I've worked with tigers. I've wandered the Russian tundra looking for endangered species. I've captured bears. And my favorite species is this Blakiston's fish owl, which is kind of the theme of the talk here. And so the group I work for is called the Wildlife Conservation Society. We're a relatively large organization. We work all over the world, all these countries in green. We do have a Canada office headquartered in Toronto. But yes, we're working in more than 60 countries, and there's more than 500 conservation projects all over the world. A lot of it is trying to find ways to make the world a safe place for wildlife and the people that rely on the same natural resources that the wildlife does. So this is where I live. This is where I am now. I'm in Minnesota. I'm in a closet in Minnesota. And the book and the project that I'm going to describe in a minute takes place way over here. It's this part of Russia that a lot of people don't necessarily realize is even Russia. It borders the Sea of Japan. It borders China. It borders North Korea. It's this like little corner of Russia that's tucked into Northeast Asia. And so in a normal, non-COVID year, I travel there a few times, but that's not the only place I go. I also work all over. I spend time in our Arctic office working in Alaska up there. And I also travel throughout Asia, from the Russian Arctic in the north down to Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Myanmar, where there's currently a coup underway, working mostly on bird-related conservation issues. So onto the bird. So the Blakiston's fish owl is it's almost an improbable animal. I mean, these are just absolutely massive. I mean, these are owls as large as bald eagles. They have 6-foot wingspans, and they stand as tall as fire hydrants. So they're just really big, beefy birds. But the book I wrote, it's not just a book about birds. It's very much also a book about the people who live in the forests and share the same space with the owls. And it's also a story about fieldwork, about starting a research project, collecting the data, analyzing it, and then using that information for good. So here it is. Here's the fish owl. And so kind of zooming in on that little corner of Russia I was mentioning before, this is it. The capital city is Vladivostok. There's not that many people that live in the province, to be honest. There's about 2 million people spread across here, half of whom are in that one city in Vladivostok. And the rest of the landscape is dotted with these small villages where populations are measured in the thousands, the hundreds, and in some cases even the dozens. And it's a very mountainous landscape. And so the human settlements, as you can see here, are really tucked where they can fit between the mountains and the rivers. So a lot of the people who live in these villages, they live in single-story wooden homes. The houses are heated by wood. There's often a diesel generator somewhere in town that provides electricity, and people get their water from the rivers or from wells. So it's pretty rustic. These are the Sakhalin Mountains, which cover most of the province. And the coastline here is just spectacular. I don't know if you guys have a mental image of Russia, but this, sandy beaches and clear blue water is typically not something that people associate with Russia. But this is it. This is prime tiger habitat, for example. So this is the tiger, a Amur tiger, also called Siberian tiger. This is probably the most famous resident of this province of Primoria. Something like 90% of all the Amur tigers in the world are found here. Now these are animals that are typically associated with steamy subtropical jungles, but they're found here. Another cat that's found here is a leopard subspecies called the Amur leopard. Another one of these pretty a species that's typically associated with southern warmer areas. I mean, this is an animal that ranges all the way through Asia to Africa, and yet here they are walking around in the autumn leaves of Primoria. There's two bear species here. One of them is the brown bear, much like the same species that you guys have in BC, different subspecies. And this is the only place in the world where you have tigers and bears sharing the same forests. So it's almost like having two kings in one castle. They do interact, they do fight, and they do sometimes kill each other. Here's another weird animal. If you've not seen a raccoon dog, that's what this is. They're true dogs. They're not raccoons. They're related to foxes, and they are the only member of the dog family that hibernates in winter. One more. This is a Siberian musk deer. If you've never seen a Siberian musk deer, note the fangs. I feel like every time I see one of these things, I think of a vampire kangaroo. They have these massive back legs to help them speed up slopes to escape predators. And the males have these pretty remarkable elongated canines.
What's the purpose of those, John?
The purpose is honestly not clear. Only males have them, females don't. And so some people say, oh, maybe they're using them the way other deer species use antlers, for fighting other males. And not really. I mean, they don't really fight using their tusks. Some people say, oh, maybe they're using them to scrape away the ice to get at lichens, which is their primary food source, especially in winter. But do females not eat? I mean, only the males have them. So it's really, it's a function that's not really clear. It's a very, very ancient deer species. So it could be, their function could be something that's lost and isn't clear to us now.
Oh, okay.
So there's nothing obvious. Yeah. Okay, so on to the owl. So this is where I was. I lived here. I was in the Peace Corps here. So after college, I spent 3 years living in this region, teaching English and working in environmental clubs for kids, taking them bird watching and that's some other stuff. So I mentioned earlier that my father had been stationed in Moscow in the early 1990s. So I started studying Russian then. So that was 1993 to 1995, and by the time I was out here in the Peace Corps, was 1999. So I already spoke Russian pretty well. So I was living in a small village down there, and that's when I saw my first owl, my first fish owl. So these are, I think owls are generally considered weird birds to begin with. And even among the owls, fish owls are weird birds. Now, there's a couple things that people typically think about when they think about owls, a couple specific traits. And one of them is hypersensitive hearing. Okay, so here's some spotted owls in California. This is a great horned owl from my neighborhood here in Minneapolis. These are some barn owls from the internet. And you can see all these birds, you can see these really defined facial discs. And if you're familiar with the feather structure, what that does is essentially channel sound directly to the ear holes of these birds, almost like a parabola. So they have really phenomenal hearing. I mean, barn owls, for example, they've done scientific studies, putting barn owls in a lab, like in this big dark room with no windows, and they kept turning the light down to see at what point the barn owls could no longer hunt. Didn't matter. They hunted in pitch darkness. They could hear a mouse scurrying across the floor and key in on it perfectly. That's how good their hearing is. Now, if we look at a fish owl, maybe, yeah, sure, there's a little bit of a facial disc there, but it's not nearly as defined as a standard owl. Now, another feature commonly attributed to owls is silent flight. And that's facilitated by their feather structure. So this is a flight feather here of a Eurasian eagle owl, which is kind of like a giant great horned owl. And if you look at the top edge here, there are all these pokey things sticking up. And so, and this is what most owl species have this on their wings. And what that does is when the owl flaps its wings, the air hits these barbules first and helps push the air away. It dissipates the air. So it's almost like a cloaking device, and an owl can fly through the air like a knife through butter and not make a noise. Look at a Blakiston's fish owl flight feather, same feather, it's missing. They don't have these barbules. In fact, they're loud in flight. It's a big bird, and you have a big bird flying through a river valley at night. I mean, you can hear that bird flapping. Now we think about why owls evolved these adaptations of exceptional hearing and silent flight. It's their hunting strategy, right? And so, and then we apply that to why the fish owls lost these adaptations. Same thing. It's their hunting strategy. These owls are hunting fish. First of all, fish are underwater. If there's a fish owl flapping around in the canopy and it's making noise, the fish doesn't care because it's underwater and it can't hear it anyway. And secondly, with respect to their hearing, you can see where this owl is hunting. It's a very shallow waterway. It's very fast flowing water and it's rocky. So, the water is just rushing across here. And when I'm over in Russia looking for owls, I move away from a river to try to hear them because the river is so noisy. So I feel like if fish owls had the exceptional hearing of a barn owl, for example, they'd go nuts from all the noise. So these are just standard adaptations that we take for granted in most owls that the fish owls just don't have. So there are two things that fish owls need to lead happy fish owl lives. And the first is a really big hole in a really big tree. So these birds are non-migratory. And because they're so big, they need to have just an enormous tree, 200-300-year-old cottonwood or elm that has a cavity or a hole big enough for them to nest in. Here's two examples of some fish owl nest cavities pretty high up in these trees. Now, the other thing they need is access to their prey year round. So again, they don't migrate, but they live in a place that reaches the mid -30 Celsius on a regular basis in winter. And as water typically freezes when it gets that cold. So most of the waterways are frozen. Conveniently for the fish owls, at least in Primoria, there's a number of radon hot springs. And so places where the hot springs seep into a waterway. So there's this radon gas that slightly warms the water and is able to allow the water to resist freezing year in and year out in these very specific locations. So if you find a spot like this in this picture here, where there's open water in winter and there's fish in there and there's a big tree nearby, you're in good fish owl habitat. So typically, they'll just kind of sit on the edge of the riverbank, wait for a fish to swim by, jump in on it, and jump out and eat it. So historically, there hasn't been a lot of competition between humans and fish owls for these resources of trees and fish-rich rivers. These images are from the indigenous Udege, taken about 100 years ago. These photos. The Udege had a tradition of catching fish owls in autumn to eat them. The fish owls would put on these really thick fat reserves in anticipation of winter. And that's when the Udege would trap them and eat these big fatty birds. And they would also use their wings and tails as fans. That's a tail right there in the bottom to dissipate the swarms of insects in the summer. But very minimal use. What certainly wasn't, fish owls really weren't in trouble from this type of hunting. And even until recently, there wasn't much opportunity for conflict between fish owls and humans. This map here is just Ternay County, which is the northernmost part of the province I work in, Primoria, and the county also where most of the book takes place. And if you look at the road network in 1984, there was fewer than 150 miles of road. We fast forward 20 years to 2005, to the start of this project, boom, this huge explosion of roads to nearly 3,000 miles. So you go from almost entire history of little to no potential for conflict between fish owls and humans to the sudden, pretty significant opportunity for conflict in this really short period of time. Now, despite this emergence of threats, there's no idea how these threats actually impact the owls. Now, fish owls they're an endangered species in Russian law, so they're protected and their habitat's protected, but without knowing what their habitat needs are, there's no way to know what to protect. And so that was really the genesis of this project. This was my graduate project at the University of Minnesota, was to determine this. And so I teamed up with these two Russians. They're both named Sergei Avdiuk and Sergei Stormich. And these two guys had been studying fish owls for about a decade before I got involved. And really, they were the only two who were doing any work with this species in Russia. So the plan was to find some owls, catch them, put GPSs on their backs, then use that data to understand what parts of the landscape are important for the owls, to then develop a conservation plan to protect them. So the project was broken into 3 parts, which really correspond to the 3 different parts of the book. The first part was a 2-week expedition to the northernmost settlement in the province to look for fish owls. So I teamed up. I flew in by helicopter. There were no. This is actually me flying in that day. There were no roads leading there, and we were working as a team of 4 people on 2 snowmobiles and sleds filled with whatever we could fit on our sleds. And the idea was to snowmobile 80 kilometers from where the helicopter dropped us off down to the coast, where there was another village which I could then take a boat to get home. And so and then you're looking for fish owls along the way. For me, this is a training exercise. It was understanding what fish owl habitat is like, what it's like to look for a fish owl. And there are a few things that we keyed in on. So anytime we'd find one of these open water patches that I mentioned, we'd get out the binoculars, have a look for tracks. Winter's one of the best times to look for fish owls because they leave tracks in the snow as they're walking up and down the riverbanks. And also, anytime we'd find one of these really big trees, it's pretty rare to find a tree this big on the landscape. So anytime we'd see one, again, you get out the binoculars, crane our necks, try to find a hole. If there was a hole, maybe go up and see if there was a fish owl nest there or not. So this was a bit of a hairy experience overall, to be honest. None of us had been to this particular place in winter before, and so we really didn't know what to expect. The idea is like, oh yeah, all you have to do is snowmobile on the frozen river, and that'll take you from point A to point B. There's no roads again. It's people here who live up here, they use the river in winter. They snowmobiles on the ice, and then in summer they use boats to go back and forth. They don't travel in autumn because the conditions are unsafe with the ice, and they don't travel in spring because the conditions are unsafe due to the ice. And here we are in spring, going down the river, because we didn't really know what to expect. And so here, every once in a while, we'd come across a spot like this where there's open water flowing on top of the ice. Now, when you look at this, you don't know until you kind of go up and poke at it if it's just a little bit of frozen water or a little bit of thawed water flowing across ice, or it's 20 centimeters deep, it's a meter deep, or if you step in that, boom, you go to the bottom of the river. And so as the expedition continued into spring, we kept running into these things. Here's a short video of us trying to get across one.
Oh no.
And so it was pretty challenging because we really couldn't go back. Once we started going downriver, we'd have these giant patches of ice just like break off behind us and fall into the water, blocking any kind of return. And there were also times where we would have completely open water in front of us. So then we have to get out the chainsaws and cut a trail through the woods to kind of bypass the obstacle and get back to the river. In the final few days of the expedition, we completely abandoned fish owl surveys and just gunned it for the coast because ice was breaking everywhere, and it was getting to be really, really unsafe. And so, looking back on it, it's amazing. This was only 2 weeks. It felt like a year that we were, dodging ice holes up there. So that was winter of 2006, and then spring of 2006 is part 2 of the book. It was much calmer. It was just me and one other guy, Sergei, where we drove around that big road network I showed you before, looking for owls that Sergei had found in previous years, looking for new owls, essentially looking for birds that we could try to catch the next year. We'd stay in these random hunter cabins we came across, or sometimes we'd stay with Sergei, with some friends of Sergei's. And then January 2007, I went back to Russia again, and with some, and then just with Sergei, threw a tent in his pickup truck, drove out to the woods, and tried to catch some owls. And this was really a low point in my life. No one had really caught fish owls before, not adults anyway, not since the Udege had, and the Udege were killing them. But we wanted to catch owls alive. And since no one had really done this before, we didn't have much prior experience to work with. And different birds respond to different traps. So something that'll work for even raptors, right? So something that'll work for an eagle won't necessarily work for a falcon or for a red-tailed hawk. So I consulted some raptor capture specialists here in North America. I brought over a bunch of different trap components. We went out to the woods. We went to a place where we knew owls were hunting, and just tried our luck. And we did not have much luck. It was weeks and weeks before anything happened. We're living in this tent. Again, it was reaching minus 30s. We'd spend our days fiddling with traps, and then spend our evenings huddled in this tent, listening to the owls hoot and not coming to our traps. So we weren't getting much sleep. It was absolutely freezing, and we weren't having any success, which is a really bad combination of experiences to endure. I remember, one night sitting in this tent, middle of the night, Sergei's in a sleeping bag next to me. We're both in our mummy bags. And it was just, mid minus 30s. And all of our exhalations, it was so cold that our exhalations were freezing to the interior dome of the tent. And anytime one of us shifted a little bit, this fine mist of ice would shower down onto my nose, which was the only part of my body was exposed. I remember thinking, what am I doing here? This is a disaster. And then kind of by chance, one day, Sergei ran into this guy in the woods. And he's a hermit. His name's Anatoly. He'd lived in the woods for about 10 years before we ran into him. And he was living in an abandoned hydroelectric station. And as it turned out, this is it. This is the hydroelectric station. It was right on the border between these two territorial fish owl pairs that we were trying to catch and having no luck doing so. And so Anatoly was like, "Hey, look, I've got an extra room. I could use the company. Why don't you guys stay with me?" So, we're still having trouble catching owls. We're still not getting much sleep, but at least we had a warm place to spend the night, and that really that made conditions a little better. And then right before the end of the field season, really just I want to say like a week before we had to, I had to leave and come back to Minnesota, we figured it out. We tried different trap combinations, and eventually something worked, and it worked fast, and it worked well. And we caught 4 birds, I think in a week, and 3 of those in just a few days. So once we figured out how to catch owls, we got it, and it worked quite well.
What was the trap? What was the secret?
The secret was a lure. So like we were putting up these random traps and around where fish owls were hunting, but so they have a territory could be 10 kilometers of river, and so spread throughout this 10 kilometers, there's an open water patch here. Another 2 kilometers away, there's another one. Then maybe 500 meters is another one. Then 2 kilometers is another one. So it's really spread out. And so the owls don't always go to the same places every night. They kind of patrol them. And so what we found was that if we gave them a reason to visit a certain hunting spot, they'd come back. And that reason was fish. So we pick one of these open water patches that was pretty spacious. So it wasn't crowded by vegetation. A lot of bank that we could move on, and then we put a small, essentially a mesh box of fish. It's like 20 centimeters deep by maybe half a meter wide, and then caught a bunch of fish nearby, and then loaded that thing up with 15 to 20 fish, and then we just sit back and wait. And once the owls found that, sometimes it was that same night they'd find it. Sometimes it'd be a couple of days. And as soon as they found that, then they'd come back the next night, or we'd go check on the trap. So we wouldn't set the trap yet. We would just have this box of fish there. And every morning we'd check it. And then one morning you'd come back and there'd be fish blood all over the place and tracks and no fish. And then like, okay, the fish owls found it. Then we set almost any trap. And the owls come back at dusk the following night and got caught. So this is happening towards the end of winter. They're really, really hungry. It's been a long winter, and they find the magic fish box and they just go nuts with it. I mean, they're very cautious birds, but they throw caution to the wind the second they see all those fish.
Is the fish box under the water, or is it on the side so they can, do they see it, or how do they?
No, it's in the water. So essentially, so if you were looking at it from the bank, all you would see is like a wooden frame. So we framed it with saplings that we found. It's just so it's just like a so we put this 20 centimeter deep box in maybe 15 centimeters of water.
How do they know it's in there?
Because it's one of the very, very few places that they patrol to actually hunt in during the winter. So they're on their normal patrol, like flying around. Okay, now I'm gonna check this fishing spot, and goodness gracious, there's a fish box here. There's not much space for them to look.
Oh, yeah.
Once they get there. And so that was really, and so that meant that on those nights where we just put out the trap, we put out the box without the bait, Sergey and I could just get a good night's sleep and just go check it the next day to see if they came in. So it was remarkably effective.
Do they have any sense of smell?
Oh, the question was, do they have a sense of smell?
No, I think most birds do not. They do not. And I mean, great horned owls in North America are famous for catching skunks because they're not impacted by the stench.
How do you set up a trap in the water without like drowning them?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that.
How do you set up a trap in the water without drowning them?
Right. Yeah. So that's the first of all, like we're picking stretches of water where the water is very shallow. So if they do go into the water, they're going into, for a bird, ankle deep water. Secondly, once we set the trap, we're waiting nearby in a blind, watching everything on an infrared camera. So the second the bird hits the trap, I mean, we're there in 30 seconds. And then thirdly, and I mentioned picking a space that's really, really, where there's no shrubbery and there's a wide bank. So that gives the bird the space to kind of flap around in a panic without running into a tree and breaking a wing or hurting itself. So it all happens once the bird gets caught. It's very fast and pretty safe. Okay.
They're pretty large. And when you pick them up, how do they react to being picked up?
Yeah, that's a good question. How do they react to being picked up? I think because they're so large, I think they're not really accustomed to defending themselves. They're not used to being attacked by things. And so they do what I would say a lot of raptors do when they're trapped and they're in trouble. They'll lie down on their backs. And first thing they'll kind of hunch up when you're approaching them. They kind of puff out and look intimidating. They do look really intimidating. But once you get closer, they'll flop onto the backs and just kind of get their talons ready to get at you, because they don't really attack things with their beak, they attack with their talons. And so once they do that, they're exposing their legs, and if you can go up and in a real fast motion just kind of scoop them, you grab both their legs because their legs are exposed, then you hold them upside down. I mean, birds are not used to being held upside down, and they're like, okay, I give up, I don't know what's happening, and they kind of relax their wings, and then you sort of tuck them up against your body, and you kind of hold their wings against your torso with one arm, and you're holding their talons with the other arm. And at that point, they're like, all right, I'm done. Do what you need to do. They give up. Okay. All right. So here's what I'm about to release this bird here, and it's pretty tough to see, but there's a GPS on this bird's back, and this was key to the project. So that unit there, it's about the size of a Wrigley's pack of chewing gum or something, or like two AA batteries next to each other. And it's held on there like a backpack. So there's straps that go over and under the wing that allow this thing to just sit in the middle of the back. Now these units collect 1 to 2 GPS locations a day for about a year, depending on how they're programmed. The trick with this particular technology is that you have to recapture the bird at some point in the future to plug that thing in and download the data. Now, I mentioned that these things, they don't really have natural predators. So chances were good that the same bird would be alive in a year. They're long-lived. There's a record from Japan of a bird that's almost 30. And because they're hunting in only one of several known locations every winter, we figured there'd be a good chance we would be able to find these same birds in the future. And that bet paid off. We were able to recapture all of our birds. So after the first year of just me and Sergey, either in a tent or living with Anatoly the hermit, we got a little more serious and started driving around in this thing. This is a pretty hardy Russian transport vehicle. On the back there's essentially a 2-bedroom apartment built in with a wood stove. You can see the stovepipe sticking up off the back. And we drive this thing along that big road network to visit some of these fish out sites we'd found in the past, and just live out of this thing and work out of it until we caught an owl and then move on. And then over the years, so this was a 5-year, this was what, 7, 8, 9, 10, a 4-year period of going back, looking for owls, capturing owls, recapturing owls. And we had this revolving cast of field assistants who would work with us. Some stayed for a few weeks, some stayed for a few years. It's actually quite challenging to convince someone to spend 4 to 6 weeks living in a truck with 2 to 4 other dudes in the middle of a Russian winter. So it was challenging to recruit help.
Was this something that was through the Russian government or through your university, or?
It was a partnership with the Russian Academy of Sciences. So my half of the agreement was to bring in new scientific expertise, like the data loggers and how to catch birds, and also funding. And then my Russian partner, Sergey Stromich, with the Russian Academy of Sciences, his deal was was logistics. It was people, it was equipment, kind of getting us to these places to do the work. And I can't just go over there and catch endangered species and put backpacks on them. That's just like in North America, you need permits for that stuff. And as a foreigner, I can't get those, but my Russian Academy of Sciences partner did. So I'm in the back here of the truck. There's 3 people would sleep on that carpet space there. And it was a weird part of my life because I'd be in a truck next to a river with Andre and Shurik, and then I'd get on a plane and go back to Minnesota, and I'd do normal things like I'd go bowling, I'd go to movies, I'd get married, and then a couple months later I'm back in a truck with Andre and Shurik. So I get off the plane in Russia, I speak Russian for 3 months. I get on a plane, come back to the U.S., speak English. It's very much a double life. And to sort of underscore the remoteness of this place, this is Sergey's truck, and here we were about 80 kilometers from the closest human settlement, like a hunting village. We're on one of these old logging roads, which of course hadn't been plowed. Or just kind of churning through the snow. It's a rutted trail, and at some point we popped a tire. We couldn't tell because we were churning through the snow on this rutted trail. So by the time we did notice, the tire was not only flat, it had become unseated from the wheel. And normally to reseat your tire, it requires special equipment to get that back on there. Again, we're 80 kilometers from the closest human settlement, which is a hunting village, which does not have the necessary equipment. So realistically, we're a couple 100 kilometers away from help here. So I was really thankful that I spent all these years with Sergey, because he's lived his life encountering situations and getting out of stuff like this. And so his solution here was to pour gasoline inside the rim and then set it on fire, with the idea that the resultant explosion would reseat the tire. We could get on our way. So I do have a short video of it. I don't know if you guys are hearing sound or not on this. It'll happen fast, so please pay attention. So could you hear that, or is that just on my end that I could hear it?
No, we couldn't. You couldn't hear it, but we could.
Okay, so it's essentially just a whoop noise of this explosion in a contained space that put that that rubber back onto the metal. And once it was back on, we were able to find the puncture, patch it, fill it up, and go on our way. An interesting nuance of doing fieldwork in these remote areas is, there's something like there's 10 human settlements in the county of in Ternay County in Primoria, and with many of these, there's hundreds of kilometers between them. So people are sitting in this little village, and then this big truck kind of rambles through, and then parks along a river somewhere and stays there for a few weeks. I mean, people get curious, and so all hours of the day and night, we'd have knocks on the metal door of the truck, and so people would just show up and just want to know who we were, what we were doing. And we learned early on it was really, really important to not tell people to beat it when they showed up. It's and the reason is this is why. If you get into trouble up here, you need help from people who live there. You have a truck go through the ice, and like if we told those two kids from the picture before to hit the road when they came by to looking to socialize, and then the next day we go through the river and they come by, they're not going to help us. So, Sergey has been going up here since like 2001. I've been going since 2006. We've cultivated a network of local contacts. Some friends, some just acquaintances, but people who give us fish, who give us meat when we go there. I bring them stuff. I bring them hunting and outdoor supplies from the U.S., like things that they don't have access to over there. And it's really important to have these relationships, because when you're in trouble in these places, you need all the help you can get. Okay, so who cares, right? What does it matter? What I did in the Russian woods 10, 15 years ago. Why does it matter to us here in North America? But remember that I keep referring to the roads network. I showed you the map. I've shown you some pictures. So this is really what it looks like. Because the province is so mountainous, all the roads go through river valley. So here's a road here. It's a dirt track crossing the broad river valley. You can see the frozen river there. Now we look at some of the data from the GPSs on the backs of these owls. It's probably hard to tell here. There's 5 different birds represented by different colors. Thousands of GPS locations. Every single one of them is in a river valley. Something like 0.14% of the GPS locations were outside the valley. And so right there, we know there's a conflict, right? If all the roads that go through Primoria are in these valleys, all the fish owls are in Primoria, are in the valleys, right away we have this conflict. But that's what conservation is. Like, that's what people in my profession do, is we look for solutions that benefit both people and wildlife, and use scientific data to get that information. So most of the roads as part of this network, they're all logging roads. That's why these roads were built. They're to go in and pull out wood. Most of the logging that's done here is selective logging. So it's not clear cutting where they go in and cut down all the forest. They go in and cut these lines in and take out a selection of the forest, leaving forest essentially functional as a forest, just not necessarily intact. And then they'll leave that road there, then come back 10, 20 years later and harvest some more. So wood from Primoria's forests, it ends up in North America. It goes to Europe as flooring. Fish also. So some of these roads are used to access fish. Some of it's poaching, like these images of salmon poaching, but a lot of it's commercial, legal commercial fishing. And fish from Primoria's waters is sold across Asia. So how these resources, how the roads are managed, how the forest is managed, how the fish are managed, how these are managed for fish owls, it matters on a global scale, because if trees and fish can be harvested here sustainably, we benefit from it as well, not just the owls. So one of the outcomes of this study was to, in fact, identify specific patches of the landscape of a river valley that are important for fish owls. And so I made this map showing more than 60 of these locations, gave that map to the main logging company that is in control of all these lands. And they now know where they can build a road and where they can log. So prior to the study, they didn't have this management plan that they needed in order to adhere to Russian law. Now they have it. So when they're planning to move into a new area, they refer to this map. They, okay, there's fish owl territories over here. We'll just put our road over here instead. Another thing that we're doing is working with the logging company to block off access to some of these roads, to some of the forests in high biodiversity areas. So essentially, by putting a giant pile of dirt across one of these roads, people can't drive up there anymore to poach or have campfires or whatever. So we're helping the logging company identify high biodiversity areas to reduce human access to. And then the last thing we're doing is helping fish owls breed. I talked about these really big old trees that the fish owls are nesting in, and honestly, like once a tree gets to 200-300 years old, at least these species, these are big cottonwoods. They're really susceptible to the seasonal typhoons, these really strong winds that come in and sometimes completely knock trees over. So there's one territory that's Sergei up in the tree there. We've been monitoring this territory for about a decade, starting in 2005, and we watched the pair there, go through 4 different nest trees. So again, these birds are long-lived, they're territorial. So they stayed, even though, so when we went back in 2015, the birds were still there. They were still vocalizing. It's still their territory, but they weren't breeding because they didn't have a big enough tree to nest in anymore. So we took a cue from some Japanese fish owl biologists. There's fewer than 200 of these birds that live in Japan. They're critically endangered there. And fish owls in Japan have been given artificial nest boxes since the early 1980s. And now the majority of fish owls that live in Japan breed in boxes like this. Excuse me. So for one of these boxes in Japan costs about $1,200. So when they want a new order, it's a custom order. The entry hole there is lined with oak. Whereas what Sergei and I did, we went to a market and got a bunch of these 55-gallon drums for about $20 each. We punched holes in the sides, attached a perch, and hoisted it up in a tree. We drove back to that one territory where the birds didn't have a nest tree, and just put it up there. And we put a camera trap up there too, right? One of these cameras that takes pictures based on a motion-triggered camera, just to see if the owls would find it, and if they did, what would they do? And they found it in about a week and a half. So essentially, almost instantly. And since then, this pair has bred multiple times in this nest box. So starting to my conclusion here. This project is for me very satisfying. I do all kinds of work now, not just with fish owls, but the fish owl story in particular, my work with fish owls is very satisfying. Wildlife conservation, like many professions, is filled with uncertainty. People like me can spend our entire lives designing studies and collecting data, then using that information to guide conservation of these endangered species. But sometimes it's hard to know if our efforts have any actual impact. So knowing that right now there are fish owls flapping around Primoria because Sergei and I have strapped barrels to trees, or because we're working with loggers to reduce the harm of that industry, it feels good. I will say, though, that the owls do not always appreciate our efforts. So that's what I have. This book came out in August. It's done remarkably well. So maybe your library has it. Check it out. So happy to take any questions.
So we'll get the light so you can have a bit of a look at us here.
Okay. Oh.
Oh, there, perfect.
Yeah, great.
I guess, does any, I guess one question I have, just like, you know, you look at all the species that are there, like living together, the you know, the animals, the plants, and just it's a really unique place on the planet. And just I'd wonder if you could speak to a little bit why all of these creatures are still exist there together. And
Yeah, well, there's a number of factors, but so essentially it's it's a temperate forest. Well, actually, even more technically, it's a temperate rainforest. One of the it barely qualifies, but it just meets. So most people think of Pacific Northwest for temperate rainforests, but this is one. And so you have first of all, the area escaped glaciation during the last ice age. So that's one of the reasons, especially when you look at things like plants and insects, there are all these really, really weird things that are found nowhere else. And in combinations that are very bizarre. So I don't know anything about plants or insects, but I have colleagues that do who sometimes come over and visit, and they're astounded by the things that are found growing next to each other or feeding on the same bush next to each other, because it's just it's not something that should happen. It's not seen anywhere else in the world. And also, so you have elements of the boreal ecosystem creeping south. That's why you've got the brown bears, you've got the wolves, you've got the lynx, kind of intermingling with these subtropical species that are just at the northern extent of their range, like the tigers, the leopards, Asiatic black bears, the raccoon dogs. So raccoon dogs go all the way to Thailand. They're not hibernating in Thailand. They're only hibernating at the northern part of their range in Russia. And I think because the area has not had a lot of human development, these interesting species combinations and populations and communities have been able to persist. So there, for example, this 800 years ago or whatever, this was there was an empire here called the Jurchid Empire, which was destroyed by Genghis Khan. And then, so there were people, there were cities, they had trade with Korea and Japan. He came in, knocked them all out, and then left. And the area never really came back. And it was the Jurchids, when they fled to the forest, they either became the Udege, who I showed you a picture of, or the Manchurians. And there were taboos about the Han Chinese marrying into the Manchurians. So the Han dynasty never really took the area back. So yes, there were people living there, but it hasn't seen the millennia of essentially of natural resource extraction that other parts of China have. So right across the border in China, it used to have a lot of these same elements, but they're no longer there.
Wow. Questions?
I have a question.
Oh, we got a.
For an owl that doesn't seem very owl-like, what is it that makes it an owl specifically? And I'm also curious if you ever ran into any tigers.
Okay, what makes it an owl? Well, it's genetically speaking, it's an owl. It's crepuscular, which means it hunts at dawn or dusk, which many owls do. It hoots. It's just an owl. I mean, I haven't looked at the genetic lineage very carefully, and I don't know much about it. But my guess is that it's pretty closely related to a Eurasian eagle owl that just, for whatever reason, took to fish and kind of went down that road. So, did I ever see a tiger? Yes, I've seen tigers on a couple occasions. More tigers have seen me than I've seen tigers. I can guarantee you that. They're very very cautious animals, especially in Russia, because most of the people that tigers encounter in these forests are hunters, and people sometimes take shots at them. I have a colleague did a bunch of necropsies, essentially autopsies of tigers, and found something like 75% had old bullets in them. So bullets that weren't big enough to take the animals down, but enough for it to realize that people are not something that they want to be around. And just a few seasons ago, I was walking up the river, up the frozen river, and saw that there had been these tiger tracks coming down the river, and they suddenly take this 90-degree turn and run off into the woods, and they were absolutely fresh. And so I guarantee, that animal was coming, was patrolling the river, heard me coming or saw me and ran into the forest, was, I'm sure, crouched somewhere looking at me. I couldn't see it, but I'm sure it was there. So I feel pretty safe, frankly, in tiger habitat. Bears I don't like, but I'm pretty happy with, as long as you don't mess with tigers, they're not going to mess with you.
As far as poachers, now that's a common thing in the area there. Like as far as like people poaching logs or poaching natural resource, or going after, there'd be people looking for tigers as well, wouldn't there?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, what defines a poacher? It's a very, very wide gray area. And there's a Vancouver-based author, John Valiant, wrote a book called The Tiger, which did a pretty remarkable story. It also takes place in Primoria. And he was actually over there researching the same time that I was doing this field work. But it's, a lot of these people are essentially abandoned by the government in many cases, right? So you got these villages of a couple hundred people who were historically subsidized by the government. Soviet Union collapses, and hey, they're on their own. There's no local economy. If they want to eat, if they want to feed their families, they go to the woods for deer and boar. They go to the rivers and the oceans for fish. Now, and then they get a county will get a quota for 10 elk, and all 10 of those tags go to some rich hunter in the capital city. Like, what are these people going to do? Just sit at home and like, all right, guess I'm not going to eat this year, So, I have a lot of sympathy for subsistence poachers. The market poachers, people who drive in and shoot 10 deer in a night to sell the meat, sure, that's a problem. But I don't have a lot of, it's hard to think ill of people who are just trying to feed their families. Logging is a really bad deal. There's a lot of really bad illegal logging that's very organized and run by very unpleasant people. And that's a little beyond what I'm able to address.
So having some of, the research that you guys have done and working with those local logging companies and having some of those roads deactivated,
yeah,
helps a lot in a lot of ways, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the work, it's give and take. So every year, we'll sit down with these guys and say, okay, we'll say, we think you should close this road, this road, this road. And they say, all right, well, and we also want to close this road and this road. Because it might be an area with very low biodiversity, like a high elevation boreal forest, but that's where they're getting illegal logging. So it's, so some of their roads get closed for their needs, and some of the roads get closed for our needs.
We got a question over here.
How close have you been to an animal that's not an owl?
How close? I have been close to plenty of animals. I don't. Can you clarify your question?
Like, have you ever been close enough to touching like an elk or something, but like not an owl?
Yeah, and I mean, in my early one of the early slides in the presentation, I'm holding a tiger's head and kind of patting the back of a bear. I mean, they were tranquilized animals, but it's pretty close.
Oh, we got a question. Where are you, Lucy? Okay.
It sounds like you have worked with some of these owls.
Oh,
I can't hear it. Sorry.
Like specifically some of these owls for a long, long time. And this is a silly question, but did you name any of them?
Did you name any owls?
You've worked with them for a really long time, and they're long-lived species. You got to know them. You probably develop a bit of a personal relationship with them. Did you ever name any of them?
No, we didn't. And this was, and we didn't even think about it till we caught our first owl. And we're like, what do we do? Like, do we give these things names? And we ended up calling them by their territory and whether they were male or female. So, a male that lives on the Tuntra River is the Tuntra male. It just seemed easier. I have colleagues over there that do tiger research, and they've been naming these cats for 20 years, 30 years. And it emotionally, having the tundra male get hit by a car is a little more palpable than having Katya get poached and skinned. You know what I mean? Like it's easier to deal with having these wild animals die these terrible deaths if you don't personalize it too much.
Got a question over here.
Was there any culture shock going back and forth from Russia and the States?
Can someone repeat that? I couldn't quite get it.
Culture shock going between Russia and the States.
Culture shock going between Russia and the States. I've been going there for so long. I lived there. Full time lived there in a village. Getting my water from a creek for 30 years before this project. So I felt like I was pretty used to conditions there. It's always weird. It's less so now because conditions have changed, but going into a big box store like a supermarket or something right after getting back from a 3-month trip is always kind of disorienting, because in Russia you go into these little stores that there's no light. It's dark. There's the lights coming in from whatever lights coming from outside, and they're really, really small, and you're not allowed to touch anything. There's a counter, and you have to say, okay, person who works here, I want a box of box of cereal, and I want half a kilo of rice and 300 grams of cheese. And then going back to the US, and you can touch it all, and there's 300 kinds of cereal, and it's and like 20 kinds of Oreos. It is disorienting. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Wondering how the
Speak up.
just wondering how the population of fish owls has risen since you were there and planting.
Yeah, so they have. What I didn't show was the kind of the species distribution. So Primoria is the southern part of their range in Russia. So we think there's between 500 and 850 pairs total in the world. Primoria has maybe 160. So a reasonable proportion of the global population is in Primoria. Further north where they live, they're fine. There's the resource extraction hasn't gotten up there yet. There aren't roads going up there yet. I think climate change is an issue, but as far as anthropogenic or human caused problems, it hasn't gotten up there. And thankfully, by working with this one logging company, it's the largest logging company in the entire Russian Far East, which is an area twice the size of India, a huge area. And so by working just with this one logging company, we're influencing how maybe like 100 pairs of fish owls are managed, which is a really big deal. So they're staying basically stable, which is all I need as a result of this work. They're not declining, and I see that as a victory. We're minimizing the impacts, minimizing the threats, and kind of letting the owls do their thing. We've only put up about a dozen nest boxes, so we haven't put up very many, and only 2 are actually occupied. Some of the boxes we put up in areas where we don't know there are owls. The river conditions are good. There's open water, there's fish, but there aren't big trees. So we put these up just to kind of give owls a new place to colonize. They haven't done it yet, which tells me that they're pretty happy with what they have.
Oh, yeah.
So have you ever come across any illegal activity or had to do anything about that in the areas you've been?
Oh my God, yes. I mean, everything. Many things are to some degree of illegal. Just like the one person out hunting out of the hunting season, because what's he going to do? all the way to, full on poaching gangs. And there's a great way to not leave the forest is to raise some kind of a stink about poaching activity. We are not armed. Many of the people we encounter are armed, and it just doesn't, we see things, we report them, but we don't try to interact. We don't try to engage because we're scientists.
In the book behind you, the tiger, they're talking.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, the group, the guys that go around and try to protect the tigers and go after the poachers or just see what's going on. Do you ever come across them?
Yeah, I do. This is the Canadian edition, by the way. Yeah. And some of those guys I know. There's different levels. There's like the county guys who I know, and they're fine. Every time we come back to civilization, I check in with them. They say, "What'd you see? Where'd you see it? Who was it?" And we share information like that. But the provincial level guys are, they're based in Vladivostok. They don't necessarily know who we are, and they come across one of our camps. They figure that they've just come across a nest of poachers. So there are times where there's like the banging on the metal door, yelling at us to come out with weapons out because they assume we're poachers, and they're going to arrest us. And then it's a matter of just name dropping me, like, look, did you talk to Roman Petrovich on the way up here, because he knows we're here, and just kind of making it clear that and show all of our capture permits, like show all that stuff. But it's a drag. I mean, there are times when it's 9 or 10 in the morning. We've been up all night working with owls, and there's people banging on the door like, "Get up, you lazy bums! We're here to arrest you." It's like, come on. So yeah, we run into all kinds out there.
Any other questions? I guess another one I have is like, so you're not an author. I mean, you are now. You didn't start out that way.
Right.
What I mean, have you wrote books before, and kind of was it your story? So many people said like, "Hey, this is a great story. You should write it." Or
yeah, sort of. I mean, so the core of the book was my field journals from when I'm in the back of the truck with 4 people who haven't bathed in 2 weeks, and you're in this like really tight space, and everybody starts to hate each other, because you're just always within a meter of somebody else. Someone's always poking in the ribs with their foot or whatever. So I tried to, and I'm speaking Russian this whole time, so I wanted to, for a little bit each day, just kind of sit in the corner of the truck and write down my thoughts and talk about how the field work was going, but then also complain about my coworkers, or document some of the weird things that would happen over there that no one else would think was weird because they're so conditioned to all these insane things happening all the time. And yeah, so people would say I'd write these short little things, and people would say, "Hey, that's great. You should turn it into a book." And then eventually I took all those field notes, put them into one PDF, and it was 40 pages already. And then, so that was the core. And then I just sort of, picked which episodes to expand on, which ones to eliminate altogether. And the book just kind of wrote itself, reliving those experiences.
And I guess the book's really kind of taken off. Like, what's that been like, as far as all of a sudden you're on a bestseller list, or you're in the New York Times? Does that like phone ringing off the hook, all kinds of interviews, or what has that been like for you?
Yeah, I'm doing on average like 2 to 3 events a week around the book since August, which is just bizarre. Yeah, it's I don't know. I mean, I really thought that people who like birds and people who like Russia would read the book and say, "Hey, that's a neat story," and then kind of that'd be the end of it. So it has been it's a very strange experience. Like I have my mother is just ridiculously proud, because people she's known her whole life are writing her and be like, hey, I saw your kid on the whatever, his book is, so she's having a great time with it. But yeah, I don't know. It's in a way, I'm a very private person. I think it's a very private story, which is, I don't know, it's uncomfortable in a sense that so many people know about what I did and what my struggles were, because I don't talk about that stuff. Even my wife was reading this book, an early draft, and from the next room, you did what? Because at the time I wasn't telling her that, oh yeah, this ice is breaking up all over, and I went through it and pulled. So it's been a revelation for a lot of people that know me to kind of find out about some of these things.
Do you write your nature journal in English or in Russian?
My nature journal?
Do you write it in English or Russian?
I wrote it in English because my Russian's good, but it's not a level of English fluency. So if I'm talking and I'm saying something like, oh wait, like the word that I want to say in English I don't know, I can use other words to get around it and get there. But in English, I can be as precise as I want because I have the vocabulary to do so. And that was one of the releases, why it was cathartic and almost like therapy to be able to sit down and write exactly what I wanted to say in my journal.
Oh, we got a question over here, John. Nice and loud.
Hi, I don't know if you want me to start back here. But what would you guys do in your free time?
What would we do in our free time? Honestly, there wasn't a tremendous amount of free time. Our days were spent, once we're at a site where we're trying to catch an owl, the days were spent with checking trap sites, catching fish for lures, and making sure that everything was in place. Recharging our batteries. We had a generator, and so we had these car batteries that we would use to power our cameras at night. So when we were sitting in the blind watching the traps, we had power. So we charge those during the day, and by evening have everything set up back at our trap sites. And evening you're sitting in the blind waiting to catch a bird. Either you catch it or you don't. You get some sleep or you don't, and you wake up and do the same thing the next day. And once you catch the bird, we're packing up and we're moving off somewhere else. There were blizzards, there were floods, there were plenty of natural problems to deal with on a regular basis. Vehicles were always breaking down. So I don't know. I mean, there wasn't free time.
You were there different times of the year, and then in that book, The Tiger, they were talking about like how bad the bugs are in the area just because all the rivers and things. Is that just pretty crazy? All the mosquitoes and black flies and.
Yeah, it's black flies and no-see-ums are the big issue. I mean, mosquitoes are just they're like these jumbo planes in comparison. They're big and they're slow and they're easy to catch, easy to swat. But yeah, and the black flies are rough, and it's one of the reasons that I mentioned this. I think pretty early in the book. When I was deciding what I wanted to study for my PhD, was it going to be the fish owl or was it going to be this other bird, crane species called the hooded crane? And as I'm kind of deciding what I want to go, like which road I want to go down, I spent a few days hiking in this larch bog which was just a nightmare. In the middle of the summer, jumping from grassy hummock to grassy hummock, and if you slip off one of these things, you're down to your knee or deeper in muck, and the whole time there's a cloud of biting insects that's just chasing you. And so you're trying to go from hummock to hummock, staying ahead of these things. And then the second you pause, you're like, oh wait, okay, do I go straight? Do I go left? Do I go right? The cloud just like hits you in the back of the head, and surrounds you and just starts going at your ears and your eyelids and your lips. And they're like, wait a minute, this is hooded crane habitat. Like, I don't want to do this for 4 years for 5 years for a PhD. I'd rather be up all night in the woods chasing owls. So yeah, I mean, parts of the year there are just really unpleasant to be in the forest because of the biting insects.
Yeah.
Hi, me again. I have like 2 questions. Okay. How long has it been since you were back at Russia? And when you answer Sadie's question, you're like, I do this, and then repeat it the next day. Did it ever kind of feel like Groundhog Day, like just you wake up and do the same thing like every day, kind of, I guess?
Yeah, that your first question. I was back there last autumn. I usually go twice a year in winter and in autumn, and I've been stuck here because of COVID in Minnesota. As for the Groundhog Day question, yes, absolutely, and that's it's an inherent problem with scientific research. It's a problem with my job. A lot of it is repetition of boring and unpleasant things, and it's something that when I give talks, especially to college students, I try to make that really clear that yes, you can spend a lot of time outdoors. It's beautiful. You interact with these amazing species, but a lot of it sucks. You're cold, you're wet, you're bored. And it's been a major criticism of the book, actually, is like, it's boring. They just do the same stuff. I'm like, well, that's science. I can't, there's only so much lipstick I can put on that pig. It's boring.
Did you know that it would be so competitive when you started doing it?
Yeah, I mean, I